Hi, Alan. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Man, you've got a lot of books that you've written over your life, and I don't know if we can get to all of them, but you certainly have something brand new you want to talk about, the Hot Moon series, as you called it, with the books Hot Moon and Radiant Sky. Love the covers. Really, really cool. I can hardly wait to talk about it. First, why don't you tell us just a bit about yourself? Where you're located, what your career has been, and how you got to the point where you wrote all these books.
Okay, fine. Yes, well, I'm Alan Smale. I live in Maryland, in between DC and Annapolis. Despite my voice, I am in fact an American. I grew up in England. I took degrees in physics and astronomy, so I do have a hard science background. And I came to the US when I was 28 years old, and I've been a citizen for the last almost 25 years now at this point. So, yeah, I have a British background. I have the two passports that a lot of people who grew up in England and have become American now have. So writing, is something that I've always done ever since I was a kid. Uh, we were talking before we started recording about a story on my website, which is that when I was about 12 years old, I used to stay in and write during break times at school rather than going out and playing in the schoolyard. I did have friends I wasn't a complete loner. I did go out and do things with my pals, but during school time is when I really wanted to try working on the things that I was writing. And back in those days, I'm sure a lot of it wasn't that sophisticated. I started out when I was even younger than 12 doing things that were essentially they'd be called fanfic. Now I wrote Star Trek fanfic and Tarzan's fan fiction and that kind of thing. But I did write a lot of original stuff as well. Sometimes about secret agents, sometimes a little more surreal than that. But writing is something I've always done and something I've always enjoyed. And so when I turned 30, I decided I really wanted to get serious about writing and started sending out short stories to publications, to magazines and things like that, and starting to get published. And the books just followed on from those.
Okay. All right. Have you made a career out of writing then?
I actually worked for NASA for many years. I came to the United States to work on a shuttle mission that was STS-35, which had a science payload, and I worked on BBXRT, which was the broadband X-ray telescope in the shuttle bay. But so my career has really been in astronomy. So I got a PhD in astrophysics, and I did a postdoc at the University of London. I did my first degrees at Oxford, then went to London. And when I was 28, I then moved to the States for the job I just mentioned at NASA. And one thing led to another, and I eventually became a civil servant. So I've done a lot of data analysis, a lot of physics, written over 100 papers in refereed journals, that kind of thing. And in fact, I retired from that last August. So that's August of 2023. But I'd had a long career doing that. So I was doing the writing as a sideline until then, and writing all of these books in evenings and weekends. But now I'm actually a full-time writer and I can have my evenings and weekends back again to do other things.
Now, back then, publishing was a little more difficult. And I'm talking about when you were working and doing this on weekends.
It's certainly changed a lot. The industry has certainly changed a lot during that time. I got a pretty good advance for the Clash of Eagles books that we'll be talking about soon. But people have told me since that if I'd had those books out 10 years previously, the advance would have been a lot higher. I think there was a lot more money in the industry earlier on. Things are getting tighter now. Publishers seem to be more reluctant to take on new writers. I've noticed this from talking to my friends who are newer writers than I am. And my agent says that kind of thing as well. So I think it is more difficult from that point of view to break into the big five publishers, the big New York publishers. I think it's easier in some ways to get into other forms of writing. There's a lot of people with hybrid careers. There are a lot of independent book publishers these days, or you can self-publish. The stigma against that has gone away. There's a lot of really good self-published stuff out there, or stuff being published, books being published by small communities. There's eSpec Books and there's Atheon and there's various other small publishers
Yes.
that are groups of people who've got together to publish. And so in that sense, I think there are more opportunities and there's more online publications, that kind of thing. So I think the industry is really just morphing. It's changing around, and it's the job of the author, the writers, to kind of attempt to keep up with that.
Of course. Of course. Shall we talk about your latest book then?
Okay, yes, to do that, I guess we need to talk about two books because I call them the Hot Moon books. but actually they're a part of the Apollo Rising series. But Hot Moon has a lot of name recognition now in the community, so I tend to call them the Hot Moon books, because the first one was called Hot Moon, and there's a bit of shine from my window there. Hopefully you can see that.
Mhm.
And that is the first book in the series. And so that came out in July of 2022, and the sequel is coming out in 2 weeks' time as we tape this, which is on November the 12th, November the 12th, 2024. And that is called Radiant Sky, which, if you can see the small lettering at the bottom, is Apollo Rising Book 2. So these are my Apollo, as you can tell from the covers, these are my Apollo books. They're alternate Apollo. I write mostly alternate history these days, and I have done for the last 15 years or so. I'm really interested in alternate history, and we can get into the reasons why if you like. But this
Yes.
alternate history is set in the late 70s, early 1980s, in a timeline where the Apollo program has continued, and it's continued both for the Americans and for the Soviets. And the Soviets now have a base on the moon, as do the Americans. Obviously, they're still using the appropriate technologies, the Apollo and Soyuz technologies.
Yeah.
So this is kind of clunky space flight, if you like. It's old school space flight. I've tried to make it as technically accurate as possible. And the NASA background and a lifelong interest in this kind of stuff has
Cool.
obviously helped a little bit with that. And so those are the two books that I'm excited about at the moment. And there will be a third book. I'm writing that at the moment. We haven't quite finalized the title yet, so I won't mention what I think that's going to be, but I'm hoping that will be published towards the end of next year.
Yeah. What a fascinating idea. Alternate history. You take something that, well, I
Mhm.
remember the Apollo missions clearly, and I followed them. In fact, in the late 60s, I remember getting fascinated with NASA, and all I had to do was write them a letter saying I'm really interested, and they sent me books and posters. My room was filled with all sorts of information about
That's
space race.
great.
I loved it. I really loved it. But here you're
Mhm.
talking about an alternative future. You're taking some facts. How far do you take the facts as they were, and then you leap off from there? How did that happen in the story without giving it away?
Okay, yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about that, certainly.
Yeah.
For the first book, which is set in 1979 through 1980, 81, I stuck very rigidly to the technology that was available at the time. I spent a lot of time reading through technical documents to find out what they could and couldn't do, what the instrumentation looked like. I even spent time working out orbital mechanics because I just felt that I had to get the details as accurate as possible in terms of what was possible and what wasn't. They were under a lot of constraints in those times about changing orbits and about rendezvous and those kinds of things. And I've tried in these books to be very accurate in that sense because that was what I really wanted to do. I didn't grow up with the Apollo program because it stopped when I was very young, but I was certainly very interested in the Apollo program when I was young. And I always knew that I wanted to write about it. And I was really kind of formulating ideas through my life as I went on from there. So I've always been keenly interested in it. So I did want to get everything right in these books. And so now we're up to Apollo 32 at the beginning of the
Okay.
Hot Moon book. And Vivian Carter, who is the first female commander of an Apollo, is arriving at the moon for an exploratory mission at the Marius Hills, which is a big volcanic area on the moon a million years ago, or however long ago it was. And so she's going to study these volcanic domes. But of course, this is the Cold War time, and it is an action adventure book. And so things don't go as planned. And so one of the things that happens early on in the book is she's delivering. There's a Skylab. People who are familiar with the Apollo era will remember the Skylab missions around in Earth orbit. And so there's a Skylab in orbit around the moon at this time, and she's taking supplies there. Her and her crew are taking supplies there. And as she's at this station, Columbia Station, they actually get attacked by three Soyuz craft. So these are the Cold War has come to space and it's become hot. And so we have the first battle in space with, as I said, very appropriate technology. So it's actually kind of a slow moving battle in some ways because they're so constrained. But yeah, there is military action there. And then later on, when Vivian gets down to the moon, there's more stuff that happens there. There are
Wow.
Soviet ground attacks
Yeah.
when she finds herself on the moon and so forth.
Yeah. Apollo 32. Wow. Remind
Yep.
us, when did the Apollo mission end? What was the year?
The Apollo 17 mission went up in 1972, and that was the last one. And when I was a kid, I felt seriously wounded by this. I'd always assumed when I was about 10 years old that I could probably live and work in space as well. It looked to me at that time like we
Yes.
were going to a future
Yeah.
where the space program would continue. and NASA had plans to land people on Mars by 1990 and so on.
Hmm.
But the money wasn't there and the political will wasn't there. But yes, I fully assumed that by the time I reached my current age, that I would actually have spent some or perhaps all of my life living and working in space. And so perhaps these books are a little bit of an homage to that, and my thoughts about where the space race might have gone if it had continued. And even though the stories do have a military aspect, we have NASA astronauts who are not military, but they're caught up in military activities.
Yeah.
And part of the fun of the book actually is that the NASA astronauts don't have any weapons with them, and so they're forced to MacGyver the stuff they have with them to protect themselves,
Wow.
and kind of press into service items that weren't really intended for battle use. So I really enjoyed writing those scenes. But despite the military background and all of the strategizing and the spy aspect and the mystery aspect, they are, I think, ultimately hopeful books about the space race we could have had and the kind of things that we could be doing today as a result of things that happened in the 70s and 80s in this different timeline.
Okay. All right. Again, without giving away the book, I'm just so curious. Do you include the détente period where the Cold War supposedly kind of ended?
Yes, in the second book, in fact, Radiant Sky, which, as I say, is just about to come out, we've jumped forward a little bit. We have a lot of the characters. It is very much a continuation of the story. The technology has got a little better in the meantime, because the technology, if we look back at things like the Gemini missions and the advances they made during the Apollo program, they advanced quite quickly in those days in terms of their capabilities.
Yeah.
So the second book begins in 1983, and there are a lot more technical capabilities. They can go a lot further on the moon's surface. There's all these things that they can do now that they couldn't do before. And the book actually does go through 1983 through 1985. And this is a different world. So the détente and the warring aspect does, the Cold War does turn out a little differently. Things happen at slightly different
Cool.
times.
Wow.
There may be different people on the political stage at home. So yes, I do cover the détente period in actually some detail during that book, and in the third book, as we get toward the end of the 1980s, there'll certainly be more references to things that are going on Earth. The books themselves take place entirely on and around the moon. There are actually no scenes set on Earth at all, but obviously what's going on Earth has a great bearing on the characters and what they're doing. During the First War, Afghanistan gets invaded, and during the second book, lots of other things go on that actually did happen during our time. The shooting down of the Korean airliner, the Eagle Archer thing, all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So all of that does play into the background, to the politics of what's going on in the books and what's happening in space.
What makes the moon such an important thing in your fictional account of alternate history?
Part of it is the continuing space race and the continuing battle for dominance. In these books, it's actually the Soviets that land on the moon first, and that does give the Americans additional impetus to keep going. And and because of this, America is not involved for so long in the Vietnam War, so that comes to a close a little sooner. And so what comes about is that the Soviets and the Americans end up having almost this proxy war in space, in the same way that we had proxy wars in our real timelines in Korea during the Vietnam times. So that is part of the impetus behind it.
Or perhaps the mineral wealth that's up there, or what is it about the
Yeah.
moon that we are so fascinated with?
And that does come into play more in the second book. I do get into the resources that are there on the moon for exploitation by both sides, and so there are valuable things up there. There's in situ resource utilization. You can actually build things with lunar regolith. You can extract oxygen from lunar regolith. We now know that there's probably water at the South Pole, and there are other minerals that are very useful that we can either make money off or use in the place that we find them. So yeah, I think that's a strong motivating force as well. And so the political thing on Earth, the political situation on Earth is a little different as well. And that also plays into the additional enthusiasm for maintaining the lunar program. In the second book, the money is getting tight. There was the environmental movement in the US and the feeling that we were spending too much money on space and not enough on the Earth. The problems in Italy, in US in the cities and so on. And there's an increased sense of taking care of the Earth and that kind of thing. And that obviously all happens. That won't be waved away in a realistic alternate history. So that happens as well in these books as well. So you can tell that the money is getting tight on both sides. The Russians, the Soviets, they're running out of money just as they really did start feeling the financial pinch once they worked through the oil reservoirs that they had in the 1980s and other things. And certainly on the US side, money is getting tight. The programs on both sides are constricting, and a lot of the exploration that they continue to do is almost done in spite of that rather than because of any great will to keep going to the moon.
Fascinating stuff. Are you going to keep it a trilogy when you finish this particular series?
Yes, yes. I think Vivian's arc will be finished. The story will really be finished at that point. I don't rule out having shorter fiction. Sometimes I get inspired to write other kind of standalone episodes that you don't need to have read the books to appreciate. And I could see writing some of those and sending some of those out to the magazines. But originally, I have to confess that I intended Hot Moon, the first book, to be a standalone when I originally wrote it. With the Clash of Eagles series, which we're going to come on to later, that was always conceived by me and my agent as a trilogy. It was sold as a trilogy to Random House. But these books I've sold one by one. The Hot Moon, I got good blurbs for Hot Moon, I got good reviews for Hot Moon, and my publisher at CAEZIK said, we're going to want another one of these, right? And so I thought about it for a while. I didn't immediately say yes, actually. I went back and reread the book and looked for where I could make more story happen. And it actually was an uncanny experience because all the way through the book, it looked to me as if I'd been seeding things for a future book. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about how things would develop in the next few years. I could see that very easily the story would continue in an interesting way. And the arcs of several of the story characters will be more fleshed out by taking them further. So at that point, I did start thinking of it as a trilogy, even though I hadn't sold the first book at that point. So the third book at that point, sorry. So the first book ends, there's no, not a spoiler particularly, but there's no cliffhanger ending to book one. That if you stopped at the end of book one, that would be fully satisfying. And at the end of book two, that also ends in a place that could be fully satisfying if the reader decided not to go on to book three. But book three is the full arc. And so I'm very excited, actually. I'm really enjoying writing book three. And there are some scenes in there that I've been looking forward to writing ever since I realized that this was a trilogy. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on in book three, and a lot of, I think, really crunchy stuff with the characters and interesting scenes on the moon and in other places in the inner solar system. So it's a lot of fun writing.
Should we talk about the Clash of Eagles?
Yes, sure, we could do that. Okay, so we've talked about alternate history set in the 1970s. This is alternate history set in the 13th century. And the idea behind these books is that the Roman Empire has survived in its classical form into the 13th century. And the Roman legions are now moving into North America. They're landing in the Chesapeake Bay, which of course is very close to home. I've already mentioned that I live pretty close to the Chesapeake Bay, so I was able to do some research there. So they're landing at the Chesapeake Bay, and when book one, Clash of Eagles, starts, they're marching west into North America. And this is the time when the Iroquois Confederacy in my books was at a peak. So we have the 5 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy who are quite strong at that time. And it's also the time when the great Mississippian culture was at its height. Some people know this and others don't, but there was a big mound building culture that was centered in Cahokia, which is where St. Louis is now on the Mississippi River. And that was a great mound building culture. And Cahokia itself, the city, had about 20,000 people living there, about 20,000 Native Americans living there. And there were other towns and villages all up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. And so this is the world, this is the ancient American world into which my Roman legions come, and its commander, Gaius Marcellinus, and several of the other characters who end up interacting with the native population in sometimes positive ways and sometimes negative ways. So it is very much, as you can guess from the Clash of Eagles thing, it is very much a clash of cultures. And the Mississippian culture was very much into the Birdman kind of symbolism and that kind of thing, and that plays into this story as well.
Well, in real history, the Roman Empire became the Holy Roman Empire when they adopted Christianity as their main religion. In
Yes.
your story, did they do that, or are they still going with their more, I guess, pagan style religion?
Yeah, all alternate histories have a divergence point. There's a point after which the timeline that we are writing about, that I'm writing about in this case, diverges from the way our timeline went.
Mm.
For the Clash of Eagles books, this point of departure is actually in the 3rd century AD, because the 3rd century was when things really started going to hell for the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
It was called the crisis of the 3rd century for a reason, right? There were all these
Mhm.
problems within the empire, structural problems, problems with lousy emperors, problems eventually with warring tribes, in inverted commas, other nations, other invaders, other people living in Europe, pushing back against the Roman Empire. And so a succession of weak emperors led to a lot of the breakdown that really caused the classical Roman Empire to collapse. And in my books, this doesn't happen. In my books, we get a strong emperor. This is all like 1,000 years before the
All
story
right.
starts.
Yeah.
But the divergence point is where Emperor Caracalla does not manage to kill his younger brother Gaeta. There's a civil war and Gaeta wins, and he is a much more reasonable emperor and has this whole dynasty of reasonable emperors that follow him. And I could go on about this for hours, but I won't. I actually don't think it was preordained that the Roman Empire had to fall in the way it did. Looking back at it, it looks like maybe it was bound to happen. Maybe the rot was already in there. But actually, I don't think so. A lot of empires have lasted a long time. Chinese Empire, the Egyptians, a lot of those civilizations lasted for thousands of years. And the
Yeah.
Roman Empire survived for hundreds of years. And there wasn't really a lot of change in the Roman Empire for a substantial amount of time. If you look at the plans of the Roman marching camps, or the way they laid out their streets, the way they dressed, what they ate, a lot of those things, the structure of society actually remained very constant for quite a long period of time. And there's no reason, I think, why that constancy couldn't have continued for a few hundred years longer. And so that's what happens in these books. There are changes. People who know a lot about the Roman Empire will see changes in the way the army is structured, for example. The auxiliaries and the legionaries are much more closely tied together. They're not completely disparate like they were in actual Roman military history. And they have steel now and various other innovations.
Yeah.
But it's still very recognizably the Roman Empire. When you see the legions marching westward, it's very recognizable as a legion, and the command structure is the same. And the characters come off, I hope and believe, the characters come off as Romans with Roman mindsets and the limitations of that mindset. And it's fun to see how the limitations on those mindsets changes
Mm.
when they meet the Native American cultures and so forth.
Are the people in your books religious in any sense?
They do have the religion of the Christ risen. The spread of Christianity in our world was obviously facilitated by various Roman empires
Yeah.
converting to Christianity, and other leaders of the other nations. This does not happen so much in my books. Christianity is there. There are people who are recognizably Christian and act in Christian ways. So Christianity does exist, but it's not quite so institutionalized is not perhaps not the right word. The Council of Nicaea in the 4th century never took place.
Okay.
So Christianity is there, but the other religions, the religion of Jupiter that you mentioned, and there's also a sun worshipping religion and the Mithraic religion that was particularly common in the legions, that still exists as well.
Yeah.
And the Native Americans, of course, have their own religious beliefs, and
Mhm.
and those are emphasized too. So yes, Christianity does exist. It's not like Christianity failed to exist in these books, but it's manifested in a very different way. But there are temples. You see people taking communion. There are still the Christ is still worshipped, and his temple is in every Roman camp and in every city,
Yeah.
just as you
Okay.
might expect.
I was surprised that they found their way across the ocean, what, in the 1300s? They kind of beat the history that we know, which even though the Vikings supposedly did land in what here in Canada in Newfoundland, so
Yeah.
Explain the technology that they were able to do that. How did they get across here with what they had?
Well, it's actually the Vikings. You put your finger on it.
Oh, okay.
In this case, like in our world, the Vikings spread across Europe in the Dark Ages, or what we like to call the Dark Ages sometimes. And if you have a strong Roman Empire spreading across Europe, this doesn't happen in quite the same way.
Yeah.
And so the Romans and the Vikings in these books are actually have reached an accommodation, and there's still some parts of the world that are ruled by the Norse, and like up in Scandinavia and so on. So there are Scandinavian areas in the world. There are Norse areas in the world, but the Norse and the Norse are not fully Roman citizens like other people, like the citizens of other countries have now become. But they do help the Romans. They are kind of allied to the Romans in some ways, and so it is the Norse that help out with the navies. Rome never had a
Okay.
particularly strong navy,
No.
although they were capable of quite large naval feats when they had to, like when they were fighting against Carthage and at other times, the time of Actium and so on. But so we do have recognizable Roman ships. One of
Mhm.
the things I really liked writing was the sight of Norse longships and Roman triremes going up and down the Mississippi. There are a lot
Wow.
of scenes on the waterways of the United States where Norse and Roman shipping is now
Hmm.
traveling those waterways. So that's exciting to write. But yes, so a lot of the Romans did get in these books did get a lot of their help in terms of seafaring and navigation and so on from the Norse, and that is how they managed to get across to the North American continent.
Yeah. Oh, they were good at it. They were hardy enough.
Yep. Hmm.
Now, in your first book, does it start with them discovering a new world, or are they already there?
They discovered the New World, and the Legion of Gaius Marcellinus has landed at the Chesapeake Bay and is moving inland. The idea behind this is that the Romans, the background to this, although it's not in the books, the reason why they're coming is that they believe there's gold in North America, and the reason they believe this is that they found that they came across the Roman Navy came across a Norse vessel that had various golden items aboard. And in fact, the reader will realize that a lot of these golden items actually came from South America. And my Romans, the Legion, the 33rd Legion of Gaius Marcellinus, is in fact looking the wrong place for gold. But that's why they're here. That's why they're marching in. And they've heard stories from their scouts about the city of Cahokia. And the scouts weren't able to get into the city, but the Romans are assuming that there is gold. There's gold in that there Cahokia. And so that's why they're making their way across, a couple of thousand miles of very, very uncooperative terrain trying to get across North America, which is obviously something that's not easy to do, even if you're as well organized as the Roman Empire, as the Roman legions were. So that's challenging in itself, even before they start getting attacked by the Iroquois. So, so yeah, that is why they're here. That is their motivation. In our history, the Western invasions of North America by the English and the French and the Spanish, they all had very different motivations, whether it was fur trading or bringing religion over or whatever it was. And in the Roman case, they have another motivation again, and it is very much the search for gold and whatever other resources they can find. They haven't latched on to tobacco as being something that might be profitable back home, although the tobacco is
Right.
smoked by the Native American population.
Does Canada play? I mean, it's not called Canada, but the region, that we know as Canada, is that play a role in there, or it's all down south from here?
We actually we actually don't get quite that far north. I think there are parts of it that do go slightly into what would today be Canada. But the three books are Clash of Eagles, Eagle in Exile, and Eagle and Empire, and they came out from Random House Del Rey between 2015 and 2017.
Mhm.
Just to give the background to those. And so, yeah, those books they're from the East Coast to Cahokia. There are also scenes down in the American Southwest. In the area that we now know as Chaco Canyon. We go up to the Pacific Northwest. We go onto the Great Plains.
Wow.
We go down to what is known in these books as the Market of the Mud, but people will recognize both from the description and from the helpful map in the front of the books.
Oh,
They'll
great.
realize that that's where New Orleans is now. And so we do get around quite a lot of the North American continent, not so much into Canada though.
Where do you get your ideas for your covers? They're fascinating.
Yeah, the book covers are really good. And I was very happy how they came out in each case. And I actually don't have a Clash of Eagles sitting next to me for some reason. I pulled the wrong books in when I was getting ready for this. But all three books are in a similar style. And so the second one has what you can see as the face of a Native American. This is one of my my Native American characters, Tate. And he is, as you can see, wearing a Roman helmet. And in the first book, you see Gaius Marcellinus, the original hero, and he is also wearing a Roman helmet, but he has like blue paint on his face. You can tell that he is also wearing some of the face paint that would be common to Native Americans at the time. And the third book, the cover features Sintikala, who is a female warrior with the Cahokians, and you can see that there's not very much that's Roman about her at all. She's fully in Native American paint and garb for the time. I got a lot of input into the covers there, and I was surprised because a lot of my friends, when they've had Big Five marketing, have said, "Wow, I really didn't like my cover, but that was what I was stuck with." But in fact, Mike Braff, my editor, and the other people at Del Rey, they came back to me a lot and said, "Well, what do you think of this? What do you think of Gaius Marcellinus's helmet on the first book?" And I was giving them detailed feedback about, dumb stuff about where the rivets were and that kind of things, and how the cheek pads came down. And because obviously I wanted to get the details right, I'm a bit detail oriented in that sense, and they wanted to hear this stuff. And in terms of Sintikala's, that actually doesn't show up as well on the paperback on the hardback, but she has a feather coming down there. And so we did a lot of research into making sure that feather was appropriate for the group of people that she was with, and so on. And so we did a lot of back and forth on those, and so I was delighted with those covers. And the books in the Apollo Rising series, Hot Moon and Radiant Sky, I also had a lot of feedback. This is from CAEZIK, which is a smaller, more independent publisher, although they're actually quite large. They're not tiny by any strength. They're putting out a good number of books. But those covers, as you've seen, they're really professional. I had a lot of feedback on exactly what went where, and in the first book, I don't know how well the details will show on the screen that your watchers are looking at, but you can see that we have Vivian on the steps of the Apollo lunar module, and in the background you can see Soviet dirt bikes, and you can see the American base in the background as well. And we spent a lot of time going back and forth on making sure the details of the American base were close enough, and that the idea behind the other features on the cover were accurate. And the same in the second book. This is an action sequence that happens quite early in book two. And you can see that in front of Vivian on her dirt bike, you can see that a lunar rover is actually kind of exploding up into the air because it's just driven over a mine. And we spent a lot of time actually getting the details of that lunar rover right, myself and the artist. And a lot of it is now obscured by the explosion, of course. But we did go into all of the details, and so that is also a very realistic scene that I had a lot of feedback and input into, and we went through several revisions. So I'm extremely happy with the covers of both series of books.
I'm not surprised because they are beautiful. They're really nice. They really get the feel across. Makes me want to read them. I noticed
Good.
that these are fairly thick books. How long does it take for you to write one?
Quite a while, yes. I should really learn how to write shorter books. Both Hot Moon and Radiant Sky are about 150,000 words. And typically books come out to be, particularly books by first authors, come out to be between 90 and 110,000 words. So they are long. The Clash of Eagles books are a little on the longer side. The first one is 120K, 120,000, and the second and third ones are about 140,000 each. And if you're George R.R. Martin, of course, that's nothing, because some of his books are 300,000 words long. But yeah, they are quite sizable books. So yes, they do take me quite a while to write. The first book in the Hot Moon series, I started writing in about the middle of 2017. And we went through, it's a little difficult to tell because we went through various stages of revision, but it generally takes me about a year or a little longer to write a book of that size. And maybe I'll be able to go more quickly now that I'm retired from the federal government and that writing is my full-time job. Or maybe not, because I'm doing more traveling now than I was, and that tends to soak up a lot of my time as well. So yeah, about a year per book is really what we're looking at. And then there are, in both cases, there have been, changes or edits or partial rewrites of sections here and there as a response to developmental editing and all of that kind of stuff that all authors go through. I actually enjoy being edited. A lot of people don't, but I enjoy the back and forth between myself and the editors, and I've had really good editors.
I was on your website and I saw that you have received awards for some of your work. You want to talk about that?
Okay, yes, the Sidewise Award for Alternate History is the big award in the alternate history genre. It's been around for quite some time since the last millennium. It's been around, and so I have won that award twice, and I'm very happy to have done so. And it's a juried award, and so I first won it in 2011, and that was for a novella called A Clash of Eagles, and that was an original novella that came out in an anthology of original novellas edited by Dario Ciriello called Handverse 2. And that is, in fact, the first part of the Clash of Eagles book. The first Clash of Eagles book, the first part of it is, in fact, that novella. I already knew when I was writing the novella that it was going to be a book, but I wanted to get the novella out. And so it was actually that novella that won the Sidewise Award for alternate history in 2011. And the series as a whole, all three books, Clash of Eagles, Eagle in Exile, and Eagle in Empire, were nominated for a Sidewise Award in, I'm going to say, 2018. Did not win, but I was very happy to be nominated. And so the second Sidewise was for something completely different. It's alternate history again, but it's a story that appears in Tales from Alternate Earths 3, and this came out from Inklings Press. And I have a story in here called Gunpowder Treason. It's actually the story that leads off the anthology. And as you can possibly guess from the title, Gunpowder Treason, it is an alternate history about the gunpowder plot. And there are some places where the point of some alternate histories where the point of divergence happens 1,000 years ago, like it happened in the Clash in that series. In this one, we're actually present at the point of divergence, and I love the artwork for this. And I'm going to attempt to show it here. Okay, not very good at this, but there we are. So that's the artwork for the Gunpowder Treason, and so you can see Guy Fawkes's face, and the story begins. Again, not much of a spoiler because you find out in the first few sentences that this story begins with a successful gunpowder plot, and all of those barrels of gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament do in fact go off, and London is blasted by this huge blast. And it's what happens immediately after that, and in the months after that. That forms the basis of that tale, Gunpowder Treason in Tales from Alternate Earths. And so that was my second Sidewise Award, which I won in 2022.
Wow. So you were really sold out on alternative history. You just like doing that.
Yep, I love it. And one of the reasons for that, actually, honestly, when I was working for NASA, as I said, I've had a science background, and so people are often surprised to find me not writing hard science fiction. And of course, now I am writing hard science fiction with the little more hard science fiction stuff in the Hot Moon series. But I've always been a history buff as well. I've always enjoyed history. I grew up in England, which has a lot of history, a lot of Roman remains that I went to when I was a kid, which obviously filtered into my subconscious somewhere. And so I wrote all kinds of things when I was starting out. I wrote fantasy and horror, some hard science fiction, but I just kept getting drawn further and further to alternate history, historical fantasy, twisted history, as I say on my website. And so that was what I really enjoyed writing and what people seem to enjoy reading. And so, yeah, I really enjoy reading alternate history written by other people. I like immersing myself in a different history than the one that I know about. There's a lot of really good alternate history writers out there. And so, yes, it is what I have been writing. Several of my stories, several of my short fiction stories are also alternate histories. Not all of them, but most of them are.
But that's it. I mean, I feel the same way about history. And how many times have we been in a conversation, we were socializing, and we have the what if this were to have turned out this other way? What would it be like now? That's basically all your idea. That's a fuel that has given you the reason to write these books.
Yeah, and on a small scale, like you say, we're doing it all the time.
Yes.
We all have events in our lives where we made a small decision, maybe one that seemed almost uh, like a whim at the time, and that completely changed the path of our lives. I didn't necessarily have to move to America when I was 28. My life might have gone different ways. I actually wasn't planning to move to America until about 6 months before I did, and other things might have happened. I might be living in Europe.
Yeah.
I might not have the life that I have now. And I think a lot of people think about that A lot of people think about it in the political sphere. We're not going to get into politics here, but
Yeah,
obviously things
sure.
could go a very different way depending on,
Absolutely. Yeah.
like all around the world, with in various political decisions that have been made throughout history. And recently, our country, other countries could have gone in very different ways if history had gone differently.
Yeah.
So this is something that a lot of us think about just in our everyday lives. And I think extrapolating through that and extrapolating rigorously to what might have happened in the Cold War, in the Second World War, in the 13th century, there's all kinds of ways that history could have been very
Yeah,
different.
for sure.
Henry VIII in England behaved in ways that completely changed the course of history as the people who were living there expected it. Nobody expected what happened, and that's part of the thrill of this, part of the fun of the
Oh,
genre.
yeah. Yeah. You want to go back to Radiant Sky? That's your latest book. We're now talking in late October of 2024. You say it's coming out mid-November, just a couple of weeks from now?
Yes,
All
it's
right.
coming out 2 weeks from now on Tuesday, November the 12th.
Okay,
Yes.
you want to give a elevator pitch for that? I'll put you full frame and tell the people why they should buy it and get them. I'm sure by now they're very interested in it if they're anything like me. But let's do that. Let's give it an elevator pitch.
Okay, yes. In Radiant Sky, the moon is opening up. And again, it's not a spoiler because it's in the first part of the books, where Vivian begins the book going around the moon. She's actually circling the moon on a geological survey. I think we get to really see like what the moon would be like for people who are there with the relevant amounts of technology. I think it's an exciting book. It's a book that I loved writing. There are surprises along the way. There's enemy action along the way. It's not clear what's going on. There are mystery and spy elements in the books as well. There's a high level of technological correctness there, but the technology doesn't overwhelm the story. It's there as background. You're not going to read pages and pages about how the spacesuits work. You're just going to find out what happens when they don't, and that's going to be, that's going to be accurately portrayed. So yes, it's the story of Vivian Carter, her friends, her enemies, on the moon in the early 1980s and beyond, and perhaps venturing even further beyond the moon into the inner solar system.
Okay. Well, when you get your next book out, I think it would be maybe at least a year from now before you get your third book out, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't see it happening any sooner than that.
No.
What I'm hoping is that it will be published a year after this one. So what I'm aiming for and what my publisher has, tentatively said might work is if book 3 comes out around about this time, like October, November, December of next year, because I like it if books come out a little closer together, and it would be good to keep striking while the iron is hot with this one, too.
Sure.
Pardon the pun. And so that's what I would like to do. Life gets in the way sometimes, and who knows whether the publishing schedule will support that. But yes, I will hope that towards the end of next year or at the beginning of the year after, you'll be seeing the third book in the Apollo Rising series.
Okay. You want to come back then and just briefly talk about that and promote that on this channel? I would love to have you back as a guest.
Sure, I would love to do that. Yes, let's certainly arrange to do that.
All right. Alan, it's been a thrill talking to you and listening to this alternative history writing. You've got me really curious. I think I want to try my hand at that. All right.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun to talk about it.
Okay. Well, you take care of yourself now. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, and if you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then I invite you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and even leave a comment if you wish. And if you are an author, I would sure love to hear from you. Until such time, keep on writing, and remember to be kind to one another.